when they were on the moon, they didn't have that.
No, of course they didn't have that. There's no indication that any of the Hasselblad cameras or the Mara film cameras were pressurized. Because if they were, you'd see it. I've handled a replica of the lunar Hasselblad camera.
Oh, yeah. They even actually had it available. You could buy at that time the replica of it.
Yes, you can. I mean, because they're a replica, they don't look particularly like a regular Hasselblad. And most of the regular Hasselblads are black, well, they got black leatherette covering. And they're beautifully made. The lunar Hasselblad was designed for a specific purpose, one of which was to ensure that the heat didn't damage the camera too much. It had an aluminium coating on it, aluminium paint on it, but there was no pressurization around it. And anyway, there are photographs showing astronauts removing the film magazine, which is on the back of the camera, and putting another one on. And they weren't pressurized.
No.
So my view is that none of the photographs could have been taken on the lunar surface because the film would have been damaged. So they had to have been taken here on Earth. And that's what I think happened, that they were taken here on Earth under the control conditions that a professional photographer would use to get the images required to demonstrate to the American people, who were paying for it all, by the way, through their taxes, that man had landed on the moon.
People think, oh, you can just snap and get a beautiful picture. You know, again, with the type cameras we've had for the last 30 years, they got a computer chip in them. They adjust the aperture. They adjust the shutter speed for the best exposure. It's all programmed in there with hundreds and thousands of programs. But back then, no way. How could they have gotten the contrast, the sharpness of those pictures on the moon without a light meter, without all this other equipment, which I didn't see anybody using?
No, they didn't. Ironically, they did carry an exposure meter on the Apollo craft. It was called a Minolta spot meter.
Right.
Which wasn't used for general scene. It was used to take the exposure requirement of a very specific area, close-up area. But I didn't see anybody use that. There was no photograph of the Minolta spot meter being used on the lunar surface. On the camera, there was a little sort of chart, which was very basic. It's, you know, if the sun was behind them, you set the shutter speed at 250th and expose it at f8. But you still had to set the shutter speed and the aperture ring, which is on the lens on the front of the camera. It's quite hard to see it. And there they had little paddles, sort of levers, put onto the camera. So the astronaut could apparently move it more easily with his armored gauntlets. You still have to be sure that you get it correctly positioned. So if you're going to set it at f8, you want to make sure it's f8, not f5.6 or f11, which is either side of it. Now, there's some photographs taken on Apollo 11. People are probably more familiar with the photographs on Apollo 11. If not, you can check them out. It's all on the NASA website. These are the photographs of Buzz Aldrin, we're told it was, walking down the ladder out of the Eagle, the Apollo 11 lander, to join Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface. And it's Neil Armstrong who's taking the photographs. And you can see that Buzz Aldrin is in shadow, because you can see where the sun is. It's casting shadows of the lander, so you can see where the sun is. It's the other side of the lander from where Buzz Aldrin is, so Buzz Aldrin is in shadow. But in the photograph, he's lit up like a Christmas tree. You can see all the detail you need to in his spacesuit. But we know on the moon that light is a very harsh light, because there's no atmosphere to diffuse it. There are no clouds, obviously. So it's either very bright or it's very dark. An Ektachrome film, which is what was used in the camera, has a very low tolerance of exposure latitude. You've got to get the exposure right to get the film correct. So Buzz Aldrin looks like he's being illuminated with a flash gun.
Yeah, you're right.
But no flash gun was carried on Apollo. No additional lighting. NASA supporters will say, it's the reflection off the lunar surface.
No, I don't buy that one either. I still don't believe we went to the moon. I'm sorry. And the reason why I'm saying this, because I know somebody, vaguely know him, but he's a stargazer, and what he does is he's been just studying the moon. He was at some grade school recently, and one of the little girls asked him a question. He was sitting next to her. She goes, are we going to go back to the moon? And he goes, well, we got to go there first. That was kind of really strange. And I actually post that up on our website, that little video of that. And then some of the other stuff he has said, like the images and stuff, he implied that a lot of them were done on Earth. So it just makes you wonder, why would they have deceived us?
I think it comes back to what you said at the beginning about being one up on the Russians. They were known at the time as Soviets, because they were trying to get to the moon as well. There's no secret about that. They had the rocket to do it. Unfortunately, the rocket blew up. 4 of them, called the N-1 rocket. It exploded, basically destroyed the Kazakhstan or the Baikonur Cosmodrome, where they were being launched from. So they gave up and said, no, we weren't going to the moon. We just want to build a space station. So they built the Mir space station. But there's some very interesting stories around the Soviets, because they were well ahead of America right from the beginning of the space programs. They had the first satellite up, Sputnik, and they had the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, we're told, though there's doubt about whether he was actually the person there. It's also doubtful that he was the first one. He was the first one to land back alive.
Well, wasn't there one that literally, when he didn't really want to go, but they kind of gilded him on going, and on re-entry, he literally, they heard him screaming because he was telling them, hey, this thing is falling apart, and he literally just burned up.
The only training he had at the time he did his flight was as a parachutist. That's what he did. He jumped out of the craft about 20,000 feet, opened his parachute and came down that way. You're not supposed to do that if you're going to claim a record of being the first man to orbit the Earth. You're supposed to land in the craft you took off in. But that tended to get a bit overlooked. The driving force behind the Soviet space program was a guy called Sergei Korolev, known as the chief designer. His name only became known publicly after his death. He died in 1966 after an operation, quite a routine operation, went rather badly wrong, and he died. And then there was nobody really trained to take over. And it's always said, well, surely Russians would have blown the whistle if America were faking it. And my point to that is, well, who would have blown the whistle? Nobody was suspecting that the Americans were faking it at the time. That wasn't even on the agenda. That wasn't being discussed. If the Russians were so clever, or the Soviets, as they were known then, were so clever that they knew the Americans were faking it, who in Russia would have blown the whistle? As I say, Sergei Korolev was the head of the Soviet space program, but he died. Who would have had the authority to go to the President Brezhnev at the time, explain to him why he thought the Americans were faking it, and then Brezhnev to go public with it? And the first reaction in America would have been, oh, just sore losers, you didn't get there first. So it's highly unlikely that anybody in the Soviet Union would have blown the whistle. And as for the 400,000 people who allegedly, did work on Apollo at the height of the program in 1965, 400,000 people, not at NASA. NASA were the organizing company that coordinated the activity of all the private contractors building the spacecraft. Boeing up in Washington State were building the Saturn V rocket. Grumman were building the lander. Rocketdyne in California were building the engines on the Saturn V rocket. It's called the Saturn V, by the way, because it had 5 engines. And then there's the Space Center at Houston, now called the Johnson Space Center. Who's the Johnson it's named after? Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was president during most of the activity around the Apollo program. Nixon was president when they landed because Johnson said he wouldn't run for a second term. I wonder why. Anyway, we've got all these anomalous things going on. I mentioned Apollo 13. Do you know the story of Apollo 13? Not the story we're told by Tom Hanks in his very good film, Apollo 13. That's a wonderful piece of space opera. The real Apollo 13 took off on April the 11th, 1970. And it would presumably have been intended to follow the path that most of the Apollo rockets followed, which was to guide over Africa, across to India, around South America and across back to Europe. The day after the official launch of Apollo 13, in the Bay of Biscay, which is an area of the Atlantic Ocean, west of France, north of Spain, it's called the Bay of Biscay because it's surrounded on two sides by the continent. It's quite a rough area. And in that particular area, the Soviet Navy were conducting exercises, publicly announced exercises. And as they were doing this, they came across an Apollo command module floating in the Atlantic. What? What's an Apollo command module doing floating in the Atlantic? It's quite a big piece of kit, weighs about 7 tons. If you were in a ship, you wouldn't want to hit it, it might cause a problem. The Soviet Navy hauled it onto their ship, and after a few weeks of sailing around the place, they returned to their base at Murmansk, up in northern Russia, north of the Arctic Circle. And 6 months after that, the US Coast Guard cutter Southwind was paying a courtesy visit to Murmansk, and they collected this command module and returned it to America, where it's now on display in Michigan at the Grand Rapids Museum in Michigan. But it's sealed. It's been sealed for 100 years. It was sealed in 1976, sealed for 100 years to be opened in 2076. But there's another Apollo 13 command module on display at the Kansas Cosmodrome. Why are there 2 command modules on display from that one mission? It's the only mission on which there are 2 command modules on display. Right, the one on the Grand Rapids Museum is supposed to be a boilerplate, i.e. a practice version of the command module. But the question still arises is what was it doing floating in the Atlantic? It hadn't been reported missing. You'd think somebody might have missed a piece of kit that size. If it drifted from Florida across to the Bay of Biscay, it'd probably taken about 6-8 weeks, maybe longer, to drift with the current, the Gulf Stream, which would go from Florida up towards Iceland and then down the west coast of Europe and land up in the Bay of Biscay. But it would take a while to do that, and there would be a marine growth on it.
It would be.
I mean, after 8, 10, 12 weeks in the water, most ships get some sort of marine growth, but there are photographs of this command module in Murmansk, with Soviet naval personnel and American naval personnel alongside each other, and there is no evidence of marine growth on this particular command module. So the question still remains is what was it doing floating in the Atlantic, not having been reported missing? Was it the actual, real Apollo 13 command module? Because the rocket had gone off course and it had to be destroyed. The Bay of Biscay is nowhere near the flight path of the normal Apollo launches. It's about 1,500 miles north of the official launch path.
Well, that is another puzzle, isn't it?
It certainly is a puzzle, and nobody's been able to answer it. I can tell you where to read the story about it. There's a website which has got all this on it, from both the American and from the Russian perspective. There's a lot of detail about this, but nobody is saying, well, it's the real Apollo 13 command module. Now, if it was the real Apollo 13 command module, maybe there were astronauts on board, maybe they were picked up by submarines, maybe it was all planned in advance. I don't know. I got no information about that at all.
Or there was astronauts and we lost them too.
The real Apollo 13 astronauts, Jim Lovell being the commander, appeared on board the recovery ship about 8 days, 7-8 days after the launch, which is correct.
Yeah.
But it still doesn't answer the question what this other command module was doing floating in the Atlantic. So have we been told the full story about Apollo 13? No, we haven't. There is still a mystery about it. Now, there are places where you can check all this out. It's on a website called Aulis, that's AULIS, aulis.com. It's been run for about 25 years by the authors of probably the definitive book on the subject called Dark Moon. And it's called Dark Moon for the very simple reason that if the Apollo 13 command module had reached the moon successfully and had landed when it was supposed to land, the landing site would have been in darkness. Couldn't land. So they had to do something rather rapidly to avert the problem of landing in darkness on the moon, which was a big bit of a problem. Now, people will say, well, you can check out whether that's correct or not. There are plenty of astronomy programs which will show you exactly where any particular location on the moon is at any particular time. Yes, it's been checked out. There are big mysteries around Apollo 13.
Well, the whole thing also, if you think about it, here we're talking about sending people to Mars. We have our space station, that it's many years, okay, and they're going to extend it another couple years. Well, that's debatable now with what's going on with Russia, because even the people in the space station, Marcus, that are up there for their tour of duty, when they come back, they have heart problems, they have shrinkage of the brain, they're shorter, they got health issues. And what gets me is, well, then why haven't we gone to the moon and created a base? Some people think we do have bases on the moon. I don't think so. But, why would we be talking about going to Mars and putting people on Mars when we should see what it would be like to be on the moon for a period of time? None of this stuff really makes logical sense to me.
You're quite right. It makes absolutely no logical sense at all. Because if it were so easy to get to the moon, land on the moon with 12 named astronauts over 50 years ago, what's the problem today? There's no rocket that's been launched yet. The SLS, slow, late, and expensive, hasn't been launched yet. There's no lander designed, let alone built. They haven't got spacesuits. They haven't even announced astronauts yet. It's as if they don't want to go, or rather, I'll rephrase that. It's as if they can't go because they never went the first time. It's becoming blindingly obvious now that NASA really do have a problem. It's a credibility problem.